Sometimes what they leave behind isn't just the inheritance. It's the secrets buried so deep they were never meant to surface. Secrets hidden behind polished smiles, behind rooms you were never allowed to enter. But eventually, everything hidden has a way of rising. And when it does, it doesn't just change how you see them, it changes everything. Enjoy the story. My grandfather's house always felt more like a monument than a home. Towering iron gates, sprawling gardens trimmed to perfection, marble columns reaching toward the sky. It was a physical representation of the power he commanded. From the time I could walk, I knew the rules of that house. Rules that were never spoken, but deeply understood. You moved with caution. You spoke when spoken to. You never questioned his decisions. My father and uncles idolized him, my cousins, and I studied his every move like devoted disciples, waiting for any sign of approval that would validate our existence. He was not just the head of the family. He was its foundation, its judge, its God. But beneath the surface of that carefully controlled world, there were boundaries. Even we as family could not cross. And no boundary was more rigid than the one guarding the basement. "Stay out of there," he would say, always with the same rehearsed smile. "Old wiring, dangerous. Nothing for you down there." And we obeyed, because you didn't disobey him. But somewhere deep inside, I always knew that wasn't the real reason. My grandfather didn't allow danger to exist in his world. He didn't tolerate disorder. The basement wasn't off limits because it was unsafe. It was off limits because it held something he never wanted us to see. When he passed away, the entire world mourned him. Politicians, CEOs, celebrities, everyone lined up to praise his vision, his brilliance, his legacy. The cameras captured our grief, but behind our tailored suits and polished tears, we were bracing for what came next. The division of power, the reading of the will, the true unveiling of what he had left behind. 2 days later, we gathered in the estate's grand study, a room designed to intimidate. Dark wood panels, towering bookshelves filled with books more decorative than read, leather chairs arranged like thrones facing the grand fireplace. Above the mantel hung his portrait, massive and imposing, his painted eyes watching us even in death. The family assembled like players on a stage. My uncles whispered among themselves. My cousins tried to mask their eagerness behind solemn faces. My father sat motionless, a portrait of control, though I knew better. My mother held his hand tightly, her grip firm, her face pale. Mr. Adler, my grandfather's longtime attorney, stood before us with a leather-bound file. His voice was calm, methodical, as he began reading. Properties were distributed, businesses assigned, trusts established for the grandchildren, scholarships announced. The empire, it seemed, was divided exactly as expected. My uncles exchanged satisfied nods. My cousins began mentally calculating their shares. My father's lips pressed into a thin line of silent approval. The machinery was running smoothly. The dynasty remained intact, and then Adler paused. It was subtle but undeniable. His fingers rested on a separate sealed envelope within the file. He cleared his throat, his eyes briefly scanning the room before continuing. There is, however, one additional matter that was not previously disclosed. The air shifted instantly. Your grandfather left specific instructions regarding a private safe concealed within the basement wall, more precisely behind the south wall. This safe remains unopened and was to be accessed only after his passing, in the presence of the entire immediate family. The silence inside that room was immediate and suffocating. My uncle's face darkened. A safe? In the basement? My cousins leaned forward, their eyes wide. My aunt's lips trembled as she whispered, "What could he possibly have hidden? Down there?" My father's jaw tightened, though his expression remained unreadable. For years, that basement had been forbidden, and now it was as if my grandfather had planned one final act. A secret hidden beneath the foundation of everything we thought we understood. Adler's voice remained steady. Per Mr. Whitmore's instructions, I have safeguarded the key until this moment. The contents of the safe are known only to your grandfather. The questions spread like wildfire. Was it unreported wealth, blackmail, evidence of affairs, dark business secrets? My father's voice cut through the growing panic. We open it tomorrow. And with that, the room emptied slowly. But no, one left at ease. The tension followed us like a fog, clinging to every whispered conversation that night. Whatever was inside that wall had the power to shatter the illusion we had built our lives around. That night, sleep was impossible. The house felt heavier than ever, as if the very walls were pressing in with the weight of the secret we were about to uncover. Every footstep echoed louder, every creak in the floor seemed deliberate, like whispers from the past vibrating through the structure itself. I wandered through the silent hallways, my fingertips grazing the cold wooden railings as I made my way to the basement door. The polished brass handle glinted under the faint light. This door had always been forbidden territory, sealed by my grandfather's carefully chosen words and the authority that made questioning him unthinkable. But tomorrow, that silence would finally be broken. The family was restless. My cousins exchanged hushed theories, their voices low but tense as they speculated about what might be waiting behind that thick wall. My uncles paced the hallways like generals anticipating an invasion. My father sat in the study, unmoving, staring into the empty fireplace as if trying to summon answers from the cold ashes. Everyone wore their anxiety like ill-fitting armor, each of us terrified not just of what we might find, but of how it might rewrite the version of him we had worshipped our entire lives. By morning, we gathered outside the basement door. The atmosphere was suffocating, every breath weighed down by the unspoken dread that pulsed through the family. Mr. Adler arrived right on schedule, carrying the small steel box that contained the safe's key and combination. His presence was as clinical and composed as ever, but even he couldn't hide the heaviness hanging over the moment. Without a word, he opened the door, and for the first time in my life, I stepped into the basement. The air was cool and stale, thick with the scent of dust and time. The basement was far more expansive than any of us had imagined. Meticulously organized with shelves of labeled boxes and meticulously stacked archives that hinted at the depth of my grandfather's obsession with control. And there it was, the far south wall. A section of plaster had clearly been modified to conceal a massive steel safe embedded deep into the concrete foundation, a vault that had been hiding in plain sight beneath our lives for decades. Adler approached the safe slowly, reading aloud from the sealed envelope containing the combination. The clicks of the dial were sharp and deliberate, each turn a countdown toward whatever truth my grandfather had buried. The final click landed with a heavy, hollow sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing its contents: shelves lined with perfectly arranged folders, legal documents, stacks of detailed financial records, and a small locked black box resting on the center shelf like a final exclamation point. The room was silent as Adler carefully began examining the contents. My father's breathing grew heavier. My uncles leaned forward, their eyes wide with a mixture of greed and dread. My cousins whispered nervously behind me. The financial documents revealed accounts none of us had ever known existed, hidden assets, unreported wealth, offshore transfers that spanned decades. But it was the black box that held everyone's full attention. Adler lifted it gently and, after a moment of hesitation, opened it. Inside was a single gold locket, resting delicately against a thick sealed envelope with my grandfather's handwriting scrawled across it. The words were simple: "For my family, when the truth can no longer be hidden." No one dared speak. My mother let out a quiet gasp. My father's face drained of color. The safe hadn't simply held money. It held something far heavier. The confession of a man who had spent his entire life balancing on the razor's edge between admiration and unbearable loneliness. And whatever lay inside that envelope was about to collapse the version of him we had worshipped for years. Adler unfolded the letter slowly, his gloved hands treating the paper like something sacred. The crackle of aged parchment filled the silence, each sound sharp in the tension-soaked room. My father's hands trembled as he gripped the armrests of his chair. My uncles leaned forward, desperate for answers, but terrified of what they might hear. My cousins sat wide-eyed, exchanging glances like nervous children watching their world tilt off its axis. And then Adler began to read, his voice steady, but carrying the full weight of a confession decades in the making. To my family, the letter began. If you are hearing these words, it means my time has come to an end. And with that end, the weight I have carried in silence must finally be shared. For years I allowed you to see me as something I never truly was. Perfect, unshakable, untouchable. That was the image I built, but not the man I have been. The words struck like hammers against the foundation of everything we had believed. My mother gasped softly, her knuckles white as she clutched my father's arm. My father's breathing grew uneven, but his face remained frozen, trying desperately to hold on to his composure. I built this empire with pride, Adler continued reading, but beneath that pride lived a fear I could never escape. Early, in my rise, I made mistakes, grave mistakes. I invested in ventures I barely understood, trusted partners who betrayed me, borrowed from men I should have never approached. And I lost everything, not publicly, not visibly, but behind the polished walls of this family, I stood at the edge of ruin. The room grew colder as his words carved deeper. My uncles exchanged nervous glances. The cousins shifted uncomfortably. The idea that our perfect patriarch, our family's God, had stood on the brink of failure was unthinkable. And yet, here it was, in his own handwriting, stripping away the illusion piece by piece. I could not bring myself to confess my failures to any of you. Adler continued, his voice lowering slightly. You saw me as your pillar, your strength. I feared that if you saw me falter, your respect, your belief in me, would die alongside my failures. So I found a way to rebuild. Quietly, secretly. I worked to repair what I had broken. And I succeeded. The empire you now inherit stands on foundations built not only by vision and discipline, but by mistakes I hid from you. My heart pounded as the full weight of his secret pressed down on all of us. We hadn't worshipped the real man. We had worshipped a mask so perfectly constructed that even he eventually became a prisoner within it. But hiding that truth was not love, Adler read. It was fear, and that fear kept me isolated, even surrounded by family. I realize now, in my final days, that I robbed you of the chance to know me fully, not as an untouchable icon, but as a flawed man who desperately wanted your love despite his failures. The words lingered in the air like fog. My father's jaw twitched violently, his eyes moistening despite his desperate effort to contain it. My uncles sat hollowed, pale. My cousins, once so eager to grasp their inheritance, now shrank in the weight of this unbearable honesty. And I could barely breathe. For years, we worshipped a man we never truly knew. We built him into something impossible, and in doing so, we had left him utterly alone. He had carried his shame in silence, not because we failed him, but because he believed that even our love required his perfection. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, like the air had been drained from the room. And then, as if some invisible dam finally burst, the shouting began. My uncle slammed his fist against the heavy oak table, his voice cracking as he erupted. This doesn't change anything. He was manipulated into hiding this. Someone helped him cover it up. His desperation clung to every word, not rooted in logic but in terror. The terror of watching the myth of his father crumble right in front of him. One of my cousins, her voice trembling, quickly added, "We need to get ahead of this before it reaches the press. The reputation of the family, our legacy, it's still salvageable if we control the narrative." Another uncle pointed sharply toward Adler. Who else knew about this? Who helped him hide all of this wealth and secrecy? Find them. Bring every shred of this into court. My aunt's voice shook, hysterical. There's more. There has to be more. No man hides this alone. My father still hadn't spoken, but his face said everything. He sat perfectly still, his hands clenched so tight that his knuckles had turned white, his jaw locked. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now unfocused, lost somewhere between fury and humiliation. The man who had modeled his entire identity after my grandfather's supposed perfection was now staring directly into a truth he had no idea how to process. The room descended into a war room within minutes. Lawyers were summoned back into the estate. Emergency conference calls began. My uncles rattled off strategies like generals preparing for battle. "We frame this as elder abuse," one cousin suggested. "Emotional manipulation. We claim he wasn't in his right mind when he made these decisions." Another cousin leaned in, whispering fiercely, "We start leaking stories to the media, build public pressure. If we control public opinion, we force a legal advantage." My stomach twisted as I watched the machine ignite. They weren't trying to protect my grandfather. They weren't even trying to honor his legacy. They were trying to salvage the identity they had built around his invincibility. If they allowed the truth to stand, that he had failed, that he had fallen, that he had been scared, they would have to face the uncomfortable mirror of their own weakness. And that, for them, was unbearable. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to shake them and force them to see what was so painfully obvious now. He hadn't betrayed us. He had simply been human. A human being who carried the crushing weight of our worship for decades because we refused to allow him space to stumble. But I knew they wouldn't hear it. They couldn't. Because to accept that truth would require them to dismantle not just the man they idolized, but themselves. That night, I found myself back in the basement, alone. The safe sat open, hollow now, its shelves cleared, its secrets exposed. But standing there in the cold stillness, I realized it wasn't the contents of the safe that had destroyed us. It was the lie we had chosen to build around him. A lie so flawless, so blinding, that we never saw the loneliness it created until it was far too late. By morning, the headlines had already shifted. News outlets, fed by carefully planted leaks from my family's attorneys, ran stories painting my grandfather as a vulnerable old man who had fallen prey to hidden forces manipulating him behind the scenes. Words like elder abuse, emotional coercion, and secret manipulation splashed across front pages. Talk shows debated the morality of wealth, loyalty, and family betrayal. My uncles stood before cameras, speaking with carefully rehearsed grief, casting themselves as victims of some unseen predator who had wormed their way into my grandfather's final years. My cousins sat for interviews, eyes glistening with practiced emotion, shaking their heads as they spoke of their heartbreak and confusion. They had transformed themselves into martyrs almost overnight. But none of it was real. The true betrayal wasn't from some shadowy figure manipulating my grandfather. The betrayal came from us, his own family, who had worshipped a version of him that allowed no space for imperfection. We had made it impossible for him to confess his failures because we demanded that he never show weakness. And now, rather than face that truth, my family twisted the story to maintain the illusion. Behind closed doors, their legal teams worked like assassins. "We push for asset freezes immediately," one lawyer advised. "We file injunctions against all accounts tied to these undisclosed assets. We can argue mental incompetence, build a pattern of psychological decline." My uncle nodded eagerly. "Create enough legal pressure, and anyone holding these assets will have no choice but to relinquish them or be financially crushed." The strategy was simple: suffocate the truth with litigation, bury the uncomfortable reality under layers of manufactured outrage and media manipulation. They didn't care if it was true or not. They only cared that the world never saw the cracks in their father's image. I sat silently, watching the machinery turn, listening to them speak as though my grandfather's confession had been nothing more than an inconvenient bump in their road to inheritance. And for the first time in my life, I felt an anger that wasn't directed at him, but at us. We did this to him. We made him believe that our love was conditional, that our loyalty depended on his strength. We trapped him in the very myth we worshipped. And when he found himself drowning, he had no one to turn to, not because we weren't there, but because we were never a safe place for him to be weak. That night, unable to stomach any more of their planning, I stepped out into the cold, standing alone in the estate's courtyard beneath the towering marble columns he had once built. The house loomed behind me like a hollow monument, grand, imposing, and lifeless. The very structure itself seemed to echo the truth now. Beautiful. On the outside, empty on the inside. In that moment, I realized I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't allow them to rewrite his story to protect themselves. My grandfather deserved to be seen for who he really was, a man who carried the unbearable weight of perfection until it crushed him. And I wouldn't let them bury that truth under another carefully crafted lie. The courtroom was filled to the brim before the judge even entered. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture every glance, every tear, every carefully staged expression. My uncles sat at the prosecution table with their attorneys, their faces carefully arranged into masks of solemn pain. My cousins sat behind them, their eyes darting nervously as they scanned the room for cameras, knowing full well that public sympathy was their most powerful weapon. My father, ever composed, sat motionless at the head of their table, his stare sharp and unflinching, like a man convinced that if he held still long enough, the truth might simply bend to his will. The opening statements were brutal. The prosecution painted a portrait of my grandfather as an aging patriarch, manipulated by external forces into hiding vast wealth from his own blood. They spoke of emotional exploitation, of sinister influence, of carefully orchestrated isolation. They described him as a man cornered by fear in his final years, subtly coerced into decisions he never would have made had he been of sound mind. They didn't need evidence. They needed a story, and they delivered one with perfect precision. The defense countered calmly, refusing to be pulled into theatrics. Every decision Mr. Whitmore made was fully voluntary, thoroughly documented, and legally executed, his lawyer stated flatly. There is no evidence of coercion, no hidden actors, no undue influence. What exists here is not fraud, but a painful family truth they refuse to accept, that Mr. Whitmore chose, by his own will, to keep part of his life private. The prosecution paraded psychologists and so-called experts who had never met my grandfather, but were more than willing to speculate on his mental state for the right fee. They painted him as a vulnerable man, desperate for companionship, easily manipulated. They pointed to his decision to conceal these accounts as proof of his compromised state of mind, building an elaborate fiction of decline and victimhood. But none of these people had sat in that basement. None of them had read his letter aloud, to the people who were supposed to know him best. None of them had seen the painful truth of a man who had carried his shame alone because he believed that even his family's love required him to be flawless. And as the trial wore on, something remarkable began to happen. The public, initially eager to feast on the scandal, slowly began to shift. Journalists started questioning the narrative. Commentators asked why, if he had truly been a victim. There were no signs of financial distress, no secret third party orchestrating these transfers. Pieces of the story my family had crafted began to crack under scrutiny. Whispers turned into questions. The reporters stopped blindly accepting my family's version and started digging deeper. Inside the courtroom, the weight of those cracks was becoming visible. My uncles grew tense, their polished composure faltering as the defense presented, document after document, signature after signature, verifying every transaction. My father's silence became heavier, his face tightening as each attempt to frame this as fraud disintegrated under cold, undeniable facts. What they had hoped would be a clean, controlled spectacle was now turning into a mirror, reflecting back not my grandfather's failure, but their own inability to accept the man behind the myth. As the final days of testimony unfolded, the courtroom became heavier with each passing hour. Every fact the defense presented chipped away at the version of my grandfather my family had desperately tried to protect. Every financial record was airtight, every transfer fully authorized, every signature verified. The prosecution's narrative grew thinner, its edges fraying under the weight of undeniable documentation. But still, my family refused to surrender. The fight was no longer about law. It was about pride, about survival, about holding on to the illusion that had shaped their very identities. My uncles whispered furiously between sessions, their confidence unraveling with every quiet collapse of their legal arguments. My cousins, once eager performers in the spectacle, now shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of a public that no longer viewed them as victims, but as architects of their own denial. And my father, his transformation was the most painful to witness. He sat rigid, his gaze vacant, as if his entire foundation had been gutted. The man who had built his life in the image of his father's perfection was now staring directly into the void left behind when that perfection was stripped away. During closing arguments, the prosecution grasped desperately for what little ground remained. They appealed to emotion, spinning tales of betrayal, of a man too ashamed to admit he was being taken advantage of. They pleaded for the court to see not the signatures, but the supposed manipulation that hid behind them. But their voices, no longer carried the same weight. The desperation in their tone betrayed them. The defense's closing was simple, surgical. Mr. Whitmore was not a victim of manipulation, the attorney said calmly. He was a man burdened by the weight of perfection, a weight imposed not by strangers, but by the expectations of the very people now sitting before this court. Every choice he made to conceal his private struggles was his own. Every transfer of wealth was voluntary. And his greatest regret, written in his own hand, was not that he trusted the wrong person, but that he never trusted his own family to accept him as flawed. The words landed like a hammer. No shouting, no theatrics, just quiet, undeniable truth. The judge recessed to deliberate, and the room emptied into tense whispers and hollow conversations. Outside, the press had shifted entirely. What began as scandal now read as tragedy, a family too obsessed with protecting a false legacy to recognize the humanity of the man they claimed to love. Commentators debated the cost of worshiping perfection. The public no longer cared about who would inherit what. They cared about the loneliness of a man who was never allowed to be anything less than perfect, even in front of his own blood. I stood in the hallway alone, watching the frantic movement of my family's legal teams, their faces drawn and pale. It was over. Even if the judge hadn't ruled yet, the truth had already escaped the walls they had tried so desperately to build around it. And standing there for the first time, I no longer felt anger toward my grandfather for hiding it all. I understood why he did. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting us from seeing him as something we refused to believe he could be. Human. The courtroom filled once more as the judge returned, his face unreadable, his robe flowing heavily as he approached the bench. The air grew impossibly still, as though the very walls were holding their breath alongside us. Reporters stood motionless, pens poised, cameras aimed. My uncles sat frozen, their expressions tight with a cocktail of fear and stubborn defiance. My cousins clung to each other's hands, trying to maintain the performance they had perfected for the world. My father's chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. His eyes narrowed as though bracing for an impact he could no longer control. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. "This court," the judge began, his voice calm but heavy, "has reviewed extensive testimony, documentation, and argumentation presented by both sides." Every word hung in the air, suspended in a silence that pressed harder with each pause. "It is clear," he continued, "that Mr. Whitmore executed all financial transactions voluntarily, with full legal authority, and with complete mental capacity at every stage. No evidence of coercion, fraud, or undue influence has been presented that withstands the weight of documented fact." My uncle's lip quivered. My cousin's face flushed pale. The plaintiff's petition for the recovery of these assets is therefore denied. This court finds in favor of the defense. Case dismissed. The gavel struck again, and just like that, decades of hidden truth were no longer hidden. A low gasp rippled through the courtroom as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. But inside our family, the silence was devastating. My uncles slumped back into their chairs, their faces drained of color. My cousins whispered frantically, their manufactured grief now replaced by pure panic. My father sat motionless, but I could see the tremble in his jaw, the slight twitch in his eye. A man watching not just his legal battle collapse, but his entire identity crumble under the weight of truth. Outside, the headlines shifted instantly. What began as scandal was now reframed as tragedy. The media no longer spoke of manipulation or fraud, but of a man who had lived for decades under the crushing expectation of perfection, who carried his failure alone because those who loved him most left him no room to stumble. Commentators dissected the dangers of idolizing the myth of invincibility, of building dynasties on illusions that suffocate the very people they claim to honor. Margaret was never mentioned, because she didn't exist in this story. There was no mistress, no hidden accomplice, no manipulator behind the scenes. There was only my grandfather, and the impossible standards we had imprisoned him within. As the courtroom emptied, my family retreated like defeated soldiers, heads lowered, avoiding the flashes of cameras. The empire remained, but it was hollow now, stripped of its god, stripped of its illusion, and for the first time, they had no script left to read from. The man they had idolized was gone, not just in body, but in the version of him they had insisted on preserving. I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The crowd of reporters surged forward, but I ignored them. I had nothing to say. The story had already been told. And as I stood there staring up at the towering stone pillars of the courthouse, I understood something that had taken my entire life to see. My grandfather hadn't left us a broken legacy. He had left us the truth, and sometimes that's far more difficult to inherit than any fortune. The estate stood quiet in the days that followed, stripped of the noise that once filled its grand halls. The marble floors that had echoed with our carefully staged family gatherings now reflected nothing but silence. The crystal chandeliers hung heavy above empty rooms, their brilliance dimmed by the weight of what had been exposed. My uncles avoided each other, their whispered conversations behind closed doors, now thinly veiled attempts to salvage fragments of pride. My cousins disappeared entirely, retreating into their private worlds of shame and quiet resentment. My father rarely spoke. He wandered the mansion like a ghost, his steps slow, his eyes hollow, the myth he had spent his life trying to live up to now lying in ruins before him. The empire technically remained intact. The businesses functioned, the properties stood, the wealth still existed, but without the illusion that had fueled it, the power felt empty, an inheritance not of fortune, but of silence. And it was that silence that echoed loudest now. Not the absence of money or property, but the absence of the man we thought we knew. A week later, I returned alone to the basement. The safe stood open, cold and hollow, its once protected secrets now fully exposed. I ran my fingers along the steel frame, feeling the chill of its surface beneath my hand. The velvet-lined shelves were empty, but the weight of what had been stored here remained heavy in the air. It wasn't the documents or the hidden accounts that haunted this space. It was the years of isolation my grandfather had endured while carrying the crushing burden of being perfect for us. I finally understood why he never told us. Not because he didn't trust us, but because we had never allowed him to be weak. We worshipped him as flawless, and in doing so, made it impossible for him to reveal his humanity. His greatest fear was not losing money. It was losing the version of himself we adored. And so, he lived behind the mask we demanded of him, right up until the end. Weeks turned into months. My family slowly returned to their routines, but the fractures remained, barely concealed beneath thin layers of denial. They still spoke his name with reverence, still hosted dinners beneath his portrait, still quoted his old lessons as if the courtroom had never happened. But I knew the truth they refused to face. Their grief wasn't for him. It was for the myth they could no longer sustain. One quiet morning, long after the cameras were gone, I visited his grave. The stone gleamed in the soft morning light, his name carved boldly into the granite, as if the man himself still loomed over us. I stood there in silence, staring at the name that had shaped my life. And for the first time, I spoke to him not as a grandson, worshiping an untouchable figure, but as someone who finally saw the man beneath the legend. "I forgive you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Not for your failures, but for believing. You had to hide them from us. You carried a weight we never let you put down." The wind moved softly through the trees, rustling the leaves like faint applause for a truth finally spoken aloud. And in that moment, I felt something lift. Not from him, but from me. Because true love isn't built on perfection. It's built on the courage to be seen fully, flaws and all. And sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't the secret itself. It's that the people we love most feel they must carry it alone.